Steve Freeman, should we go ahead and get started? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Fineman. I'm a former ADL Regional Board Chair here in New York, New Jersey, and I'm currently the co-chair of the Global Leadership Council at ADL. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our breakout session entitled Securing Democracy, Taking Hate and Extremism to Court. First, a few brief housekeeping items. As you know, this breakout session has been approved for CLE credit. It's also being live streamed for those attending virtually. For folks in the room who are seeking CLE credit, please sign in over in the corner over here to verify your attendance. For those of you online, I will share 2 CLE codes during the program. They'll also appear on the screen. Please be sure to write down those codes and enter them on the Google Survey evaluation form that will be emailed to you after the program. We'd like for this program to be as interactive as we can possibly do in the short time we have together. For those in the room today, please be sure to write down questions on note cards that have been provided. An ADL staff member will be collecting those cards toward the end of the program, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. If you would like to ask a question online, you can send your questions by email to nincle@adl.org. That's nincle@adl.org. Without out of the way, let's get right to it. I want to introduce our esteemed panel. Their full bios are available on the ADL Never Is Now website, but I'll give you some brief introductions. Jordan Matthews is a former assistant U.S. state attorney and experienced trial lawyer who is currently of counsel at Jones Day. As a federal prosecutor, Ms. Matthews investigated and prosecuted a wide range of crimes, including national security, espionage, cybercrime, civil rights, and RICO cases. She currently focuses her practice on internal government investigations, high-stakes civil and criminal investigation and litigation, and compliance counseling. Rick Sawyer is the special counsel for hate crimes in the Civil Rights Bureau of the New York Attorney General's Office. In this capacity, Mr. Sawyer is responsible for enforcing New York civil rights laws to protect New Yorkers from bias-based violence and intimidation. And Tanya Gersh is a Montana resident and social justice advocate in the fight against hate and extremism in all of its forms. In connection with her work, Ms. Gersh has drawn from her own experience as a plaintiff in a successful federal civil rights lawsuit against Andrew England, the founder of a neo-Nazi website, The Daily Stormer, who had orchestrated a horrific harassment campaign, relentlessly terrorizing Ms. Gersh and her family with anti-Semitic threats. To help frame our conversation today, I'll start by saying, as a civil litigator myself, litigation is an extremely important tool, yet vastly underutilized in the fight against extremism and hate. There is no question that now is the time for increased vigilance and action. As you all know, recent acts of extremist violence have put our democracy and communities across the country at significant risk. In 2017, white supremacists marched in Charlottesville, resulting in the death of one counter-protester and injury to many more. In 2020, members of an extremist group allegedly plotted to kidnap the governor of Michigan, as well as the governors of Ohio and Virginia. In 2021, groups motivated by extremist ideologies and conspiracy theories attacked our capital. And we continue to face threats of violence against government officials and election workers, secretaries of state, law enforcement officers, judges, and even medical professionals and local school officials. In the wake of all of these threats, ADL has, through its Democracy Initiatives Framework, expanded its capacity to provide legal support to those who find themselves in the crosshairs of extremists and hate. ADL experts advised and provided support in the Charlottesville case, and we currently serve as pro bono counsel representing the District of Columbia in a federal civil rights lawsuit against two extremist groups, Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, and as certain of their leaders and members for their role in the January 6, 2021 attack. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Even as ADL works to expand the scope of its impact through civil litigation, we know that we cannot do it alone. Using the law to hold extremist groups and individuals accountable require a whole of society approach. With support from civil litigators, government attorneys, and individual plaintiffs who are able to come forward after suffering unimaginable harm. Fortunately, we are joined here today by three such individuals. So Rick and Jordan, I'd like to start with you. Can you help shed some light on the legal landscape when it comes to combating hate and extremism? What types of civil litigation claims exist, and where have you seen the most room for creativity?
So I'll start out by discussing some of the statutory landscape. So lawyers who are here for CLE credit are used to hearing just lists and lists of statutes. So I'll tell a little story. So following the Civil War, the United States did something unprecedented. It enfranchised thousands and thousands of people, mostly in the South, all formerly enslaved or mostly formerly enslaved black people. And what happened? The black people turned out to the polls. The formerly enslaved people exercised their right to vote, and they started electing black people to Congress. And a group of white people became afraid that black people were replacing them. Sound familiar? And banded together into an organization called the Ku Klux Klan, and using violence and other forms of intimidation, set out to stop black people from voting. Well, the Constitution had just been amended with the 14th Amendment that gave, and the 15th Amendment that gave Congress the power to enforce the amendments through legislation. And they passed a series of acts. The one we're going to talk about today is called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It was technically also called the Third Enforcement Act. They didn't get it right the first two times. But it was an act that was gave the federal government sweeping powers against the Ku Klux Klan. And more importantly, for our purposes, it gave individual citizens the right to sue people who were engaged in conspiracies to subvert other people's exercise of their civil rights. What happened after this act was passed, President Grant basically stomped out the Ku Klux Klan in the South in the course of about 4 years. And then in 1876, the Supreme Court ruled part of it to be unconstitutional. There was a contested presidential election, and then after the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction ended, and this statute fell into what law professors call desuetude, which is just a fancy word of saying disuse. Desuetude itself is a word that has fallen into desuetude. Until the echoes that you heard earlier today started occurring to some civil litigators. Wait, there are all of these people out here who are afraid that groups of people are replacing them and are banding together to stop them from exercising their rights. And that all came to a crescendo with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And a number of civil litigators put together a really groundbreaking case using this old Ku Klux Klan statute as one of many bases to sue the organizers of that hateful event for the violence that ensued. And that gave the rest of us all kinds of great ideas about how to use Section 1985, which is where the Ku Klux Klan Act is now codified. My own office is pursuing a voter protection lawsuit using that statute against some people who sent out some robocalls trying to intimidate black people from voting by mail. So that's on the federal level. Section 1985 and its companion statute, Section 1986, gives private people the right to sue the Ku Klux Klan, the Proud Boys, any other organization that is conspiring together to deprive people of their civil rights. On the state level, there are all kinds of other sort of companion statutes. So in New York, we have New York Civil Rights Law, Section 40C, which says is very similar to Section 1985, but it gives private people the right to sue individuals or groups who have deprived them of their civil rights based on a protected characteristic. In 1978, the statute was strengthened thanks partly to the ADL, which intervened because of a series of synagogue burnings, and it can be made stronger still. But it is, on the state level, what my office uses. We also have Civil Rights Law Section 79N, which gives a private cause, or gives our office a way to sue people for what in the criminal world would be a hate crime, so an act of bias-based violence or intimidation. Our office recently strengthened that law through legislation providing specified penalties for individuals. But that basket of laws is kind of where we start. But then there's some way more creative things we can get into.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, we still have our traditional civil tort claims as well, right? So when we see hate crimes, I think a lot of times we immediately jump to what's the hate crime statute, what can we, what specifically addresses the hate aspect. But even in states, for example, where there's not a great hate crime statute, where either one doesn't exist at all or it's not very robust, there are still civil claims, civil tort claims that people can bring in those instances. And so these are all things that the lawyers in the room for sure will have heard of before, such as defamation, invasion of privacy, trespass, assault and battery, all of these things that you might just use, in a sort of run-of-the-mill type of personal injury case, you could still apply in the hate crimes context in order to get some benefit, some justice in those instances. And just one example, at least on the defamation front, we talked a little bit about conspiracy theories and that sort of thing. One sort of example I just wanted to highlight was the lawsuit that was brought by Dominion and Smartmatic, who did a lot of the voting machines, right? So they sued OAN and the MyPillow guy for defamation, essentially saying, look, you all knew that what you were saying about the election being rigged was false, and suffered extreme reputational harm as a result, and now you have to pay for it. And both of those suits are still being litigated, still moving forward. And while that's not, specifically a hate crime, it is a way that we can, start holding people accountable for doing these sorts of things, and in that instance. The other thing I just wanted to highlight as well here is, as we all know, the internet pervades our everyday lives at this point, right? And so a lot of the hate activity that we see is taking place on the internet. And so two things I just wanted to highlight, maybe people are familiar with this, but I'm gonna explain these terms just in case, are doxing as well as swatting. So what is doxing? Doxing is essentially when someone gets your very sensitive personal information like home address, phone number, that sort of thing, and post it on the internet. And so the way we see this a lot of times is, let's say white supremacist group decides that I'm advocating for some policy that they don't like. And they're like, here's Jordan's home address, go mail her 1 million flyers. I mean, that would be the tame version, right? And now suddenly my inbox and my mailbox is literally overflowing so that I can't get my regular mail. The worst version would be go, throw Molotov cocktails in her window, and now all of a sudden my family fears for their safety. I can no longer go back to my home. It can affect your work. It literally can ruin people's lives. Swatting is kind of a variation on that, and that's essentially calling into 911 some sort of law enforcement services and saying that there's a threat when there's not. So calling in some sort of crime, essentially, that's going to cause the full force of law enforcement to come down on somebody's address. And so they say, Jordan's in there, you know, she's got a gun, she's holding 5 children hostage, you need to go immediately. And what happens when you do that? Literally, the SWAT team shows up at your door, they don't knock, they kick in the door, and they literally come in with guns blazing, which, as everyone can imagine, is a huge threat, both to the officer's safety and to the people who have been swatted, right? And so those are other things that we're seeing being used, unfortunately, I mean, period, but also in the hate context. And so thankfully some states are slowly moving towards making laws that criminalize or prevent those activities as well.
I think this is a good segue to introduce you all to Tanya. One of the questions that we ask ourselves is, you know, is civil litigation a worthwhile exercise in this space? And I think Tanya's experience and story answers that for us. Tanya.
Thanks. So I live in Whitefish, Montana, and I tell my sons I'm off to New York for the weekend, and they say, oh, you're going to fight Nazis this weekend, Mom? Like, yeah, I'm going to go fight Nazis this weekend. Back in 2016, I was doxxed. Doxing, after a meeting, the mother of a neo-Nazi and her asking me to sell her commercial real estate building, turns out it was the mother of Richard Spencer, the neo-Nazi that coined the term alt-right. And he accused me publicly of extortion in her name. That caught the attention of neo-Nazis around the country, in particular the Daily Stormer website. Andrew Anglin with the Daily Stormer website published all of my contact information, including every single one of my social media accounts. He went everywhere he could, and all of his followers, his 300,000 followers, went everywhere they could on the internet and completely tried to ruin me. Their goal was to drive me to the brink of suicide. The messages were, we don't have to even touch you, you're gonna do it yourself. And the amount of messages and the amount of hurt, you think, oh, it's just a few emails. No, you know what? One day, I was just a mom from Montana. I was in the PTA, I'm a real estate agent. I had my life laid out for me exactly the way I wanted. I had 2 beautiful boys. I live in this small resort town. It was a very peaceful life. The next morning, my life was not only bombarded by hate that I didn't even know existed in the world, by the way. I'm a West Coast, you know, I live in the Rocky Mountains, you know, I'm like, my kids are the only Jewish people in the school. They're kind of cool because, you know, I get to come in and light the Hanukkah candles. I had no idea that there was this kind of hate in the world. I had no idea that the Daily Stormer website even existed. And in one day, not only was my life turned completely upside down, but life as I knew it was completely de-virginized. Everything that I knew to be real was taken from me. They tried to take away my real estate license. They went to websites like she'sahomewrecker.com and left tons and tons of messages. Oh, you can still see those if you Google my name. By the way, if you want to know about the case, because I don't have a ton of time, please Google it. It'll give you all the details of my case and how it all played out. What I want to tell you is what happened after I got doxxed. So here we were. It was absolutely terrifying, as you can imagine. They planned a march on Whitefish that was supposed to end in my home. The march on Whitefish never could take place, so that's when they started to plan the Charlottesville march. This time period is all connected to one another. During this time period, I got help from the ADL, I got help from Homeland Security, I got help from FBI, obviously. But it was SPLC that finally came to my door and said, Tanya, we've been trying to take these guys down for years. And we haven't been able to because they keep doing this to public figures. You're a private citizen. They had no right to do this to you. And by the way, they also did it to my 12-year-old son. They published all of his contact information, and he was studying for his bar mitzvah at the time. You can imagine what it was like for me as a Jewish woman to say, yes, honey, you have to still keep studying, right? So everyone always asks me, it's their first question, Tanya, why did you fight? This is scary. You're nuts. Why are you putting yourself out there as a Jewish woman to the whole neo-Nazi world? And I'll tell you, I had these two little boys looking up at me, and they're like, Mom, like, I'm not sure I want to be a part of all of this. This is really scary. Like, what if you're not on the right side of history? And I had to prove them wrong. So when SPLC said, SPLC is Southern Poverty Law Center. They have been fighting for social justice since Dr. Martin Luther King days. They're from Alabama. Now they're all over the country. Definitely Google them if you don't know who they are. It was an honor, an absolute honor to work with their legal team. So they asked me to fight, and I said, count me in. I'm not sure I even really thought about the repercussions at that point. My life now, obviously, I don't RSVP to anything on Facebook. If I'm somewhere, I make sure that there's security. My life is very different. I look over my shoulders all the time, especially because I'm still advocating. There's a documentary coming out very soon about my story that actually follows the rise of hate in America, featuring my story, and also follows the rise of Nazi power and hate in the hate movement there. So anyway, I guess.
Why don't you tell us a little bit how the lawsuit turned out?
Yeah. So Andrew Anglin was the defendant with the Daily Stormer website. We won. It took 2 years. Thank you. We won, and we had a $14 million judgment. We asked for $5 million. A federal judge wanted to send a message, a very loud message to haters in the world. Don't do this. And here I am, and I think that my biggest message is that we are in a time that we have to fight. It is unbelievable how many people talk to me and say, whoa, that's crazy. I just don't want to put myself, I know what I'm going through is really scary, but I cannot. Nazis are scary. But I will tell you one thing. Not one of these cowards showed up at my doorstep. And Andrew Anglin never showed up for court. We won by default. Andrew Anglin, thank you. Andrew Anglin is still hiding. If you read the news today, actually it's in the news, there is finally a warrant out for his arrest. So he is a criminal now, and if he ever shows his face again, he will be taken to jail. But I guess my message is, it's time to stand up. Don't be afraid to take these cases. Don't be afraid to bring these cases. Fight them, and you will win.
Way to go, Tanya. So, Jordan and Rick, Tanya's case is clearly an example of a success story, but what about cases where, for example, restitution has already been ordered on the criminal side, or the cases where the defendant is judgment-proof? What can civil litigation accomplish in these cases? Is there still a reason to bring the lawsuit?
So I'm a civil litigator, so I will always say yes. There's always a reason to bring a lawsuit. But no, I mean, Andrew Anglin can't pay a $14 million judgment, but Tanya owns Daily Stormer now. I mean, that's he can't publish on his own website anymore. So I mean that's effective. So yeah, I mean these cases aren't often going to be about the money or the recovery. What these cases are about is holding someone accountable for what they did, and not just for the individual who they harmed, but for the community that they harmed. I mean, Tanya wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for Jews everywhere. And plaintiffs who bring these cases, witnesses who cooperate with my office so that my office can bring these cases, are standing up for people who are being targeted for who they are. And that's I'm sorry, my phone is buzzing. Classic mistake as a speaker. So they're standing up for who they are and for who their community is. You know, the other thing is that we don't think about, there's a big disconnect between the people who are out on the streets doing the hate crime, the people on the subway who are targeting Asian people, the people who are scribbling swastikas on synagogues, and the people out in the world who are fomenting the hate. The people like Andrew Anglin usually don't have the courage to go out and actually commit the crimes. And so by targeting these groups in creative ways, by targeting groups that are fomenting hate but also violating the law while they're doing it, you're taking the megaphone away from the people who are inspiring the street level kinds of crimes that do get prosecuted. And you're taking a much bigger bite out of the apple.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think, particularly for the lawyers in the room, now in Tanya's case, there was a default judgment, but if they actually litigated, there is the opportunity for discovery, right? And who wouldn't want to get a look at Patriot Front's, bank records? I mean, I certainly would. And so discovery, I think, can actually be a big tool for helping to understand how are they funding this stuff? How are they disseminating this material? What are ways we can look to see how we can attack that? So even if ultimately maybe the lawsuit is not successful or it settles or that sort of thing, there's still a lot of information that can be learned that can be useful to us in other ways. The other thing is, as all the litigators in the room know, a lot of cases, period, settle, right? And so in settlement agreements, I think there is some room for creative settlement terms. So for example, maybe people have to dismantle whatever websites or social media accounts they've created, right? They need to disband their mailing lists. They need to go through some bias training or hopefully reprogramming. They should be required to do some sort of community service, right? You can be very creative in your settlement agreements. So even if ultimately you're not going to get that big paycheck, you might be able to still make a significant impact for your community.
Let me ask you all three of you, what about the idea of deterrence? Can lawsuits like this, like Tanya's, deter bad actors in the future or not? Tanya, you want to take a run at your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. It's all about setting a precedent, right? I guarantee you that most of Andrew England's followers think he's a coward at this point. Maybe they moved on to the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. Maybe they didn't decide to completely change their minds totally, but I guarantee you they're thinking twice about just sending off negative messages when their leader was literally taken down and run out of the country. So absolutely. Also too, what happened to me was huge, right? On this really big, grand scale. But breaking this down into very smaller terms, think about how many kids are losing their lives and taking their own lives on a regular basis because they're being ganged up on by a bunch of kids at school. Those are the lessons that cases like mine can really teach. I love talking to a group of students and telling them my story and say, think before you press send. So the more of this that can happen, the more we can fight, the more messages that we can send that accountability is real. And not only is accountability real, but they're going to be really big judgments, the better.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also say, I think the deterrent effect is also in the fact that it reinforces what our cultural norm is, right? And so I think right now we're living in a time where there are a lot of dog whistles out there, and it's being either encouraged or not punished, right? And so I think that when we bring these types of suits and we see that people are punished and they are held accountable, it reinforces that you are not allowed to do this, that these activities are not permitted in our society, that we will hold you accountable if you participate in hate crimes. And I think that it's critical, both for our justice system generally, but also for our just national culture to continue to hold people who commit these horrific acts accountable. And so I just think that bringing these suits and seeing victory, even without getting a paycheck at the end of the day, just it enforces what we ultimately want to be what our culture is.
And these lawsuits aren't going to end hate. Hate's protected in the United States Constitution. The First Amendment protects hateful speech, it protects hateful thoughts. What these kinds of lawsuits help do is show you the lines that you have to color in if you want to be doing these kinds of dog whistles. And that itself, I think, I think you put it probably better than I'm about to, but that itself is an accomplishment where you say, you're corralling what people are allowed to do and what people think that they're allowed to do. There's also the question of specific deterrence, the deterrence against the individuals who are actually being sued. Because even if you don't end up with a $14 million judgment at the end of the day, the lawyers in the room know that it sucks to get sued. And not for the lawyers, but for their clients. It's massively expensive. It opens your whole life up to discovery. It can ruin your credit. It can ruin your opportunity to do a lot of things that you would otherwise be doing with your time when you have to respond to discovery requests, get ready for depositions, testify, et cetera. So putting people through the ringer like that really makes them think twice about acting out in the public sphere.
I suppose the media attention that these things get are also lead to some deterrent effect as well. All right, so for all three of you, what are the biggest barriers in bringing civil litigation against extremists, actors, or groups? Are there gaps in the law? Are plaintiffs reluctant to come forward? Are these cases hard to investigate? Something else. Jordan, you want to start?
Sure. One of the biggest challenges, I think, to bringing these suits is actually fear, which is what Tanya talked about. So, I'm sure everyone in this room knows of an incident that, in theory, might have been ripe to bring this type of case, right? Whether it be a civil hate crimes, under a civil hate crime statute, a battery case, assault case, in civil court. But a lot of times, as Tanya mentioned, it's kind of this thing of like, I don't want to make it a bigger deal. I don't want to be doxxed. I don't want this thing to happen to me. And that is a very real fear. And certainly, back when I was a prosecutor, it was something we encountered as well. And so, honestly, it's very challenging to find plaintiffs because while these offenses are very prevalent, there are not many people who want to participate. And so, I just want to give a second shout out to Tanya for being brave enough to go forward with her lawsuit. So. But another big issue is the cost of litigation, right? So litigation is not cheap, and it takes a long time. Tanya talked about, 2+ years, which actually sounds kind of fast to me for litigation, although I suppose the default judgment helped. But But litigation takes a really long time, and so to have your life to be in limbo for the next 4+ years while you litigate this, and then have these, white supremacists or neo-Nazis or whoever they are, at your doorstep essentially for the next 4 years, really is a big thing to take on. So when you kind of couple the cost with the fear, I think those are kind of two of the biggest hurdles. And I know we'll talk a little bit about this more, but that's why I think partnering with other organizations really is so critical here, because like, for example, at my firm, we often will take on cases like that pro bono that helps with the cost aspect, right? And so I think having partnerships and helping to identify these cases for counsel that is willing to do it for free is critical.
Well, and piggybacking on that, I would just say that state attorney general's offices, you've already paid for us to do through your taxes to do these kinds of cases. So, I absolutely echo that. It takes an immense amount of courage to be a plaintiff or a witness in one of these cases. One of the advantages with working with an office like ours is that when the lawsuit gets filed, we're the ones who are the plaintiffs, the people of the state of New York. It's not an individual synagogue. It's not an individual victim. So there's some safety behind that. Our office did an in-depth investigation of the recent tragic shooting in Buffalo. And what we were looking at was the role that social media companies played in radicalizing the shooter, helping the shooter to learn how to arm himself, use weapons, and get all of his protective gear, and then actually carry out and live stream his atrocity. He killed 10 black people, injured 3 additional people during a shooting spree in a grocery store that he live streamed. And what we were looking at was, is there a litigation hook here? Is there a way to hold someone accountable for the radicalization that happened? And the big barrier we saw in doing this kind of case, or even going after somebody who posts a video like this on the internet, which is something that our office believed shouldn't even be legal, is Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, which protects social media companies from basically any kind of lawsuit. I mean, it's a massive oversimplification, but in some ways it's not. It really is the first thing that social media companies go to anytime they're sued for anything. And it is a very expansive shield on their liability. So even if we had, and we didn't have this, but even if we had stone cold evidence that YouTube algorithms had somehow caused this person to become a killer, which again, we didn't have. We didn't have that kind of evidence. We would not be able to go and sue YouTube. Or if we did, Section 230 would be an issue. So that's a big issue with how we can handle the online aspect of hate speech and hate conduct.
And one thing just to add on here that is often a similar sort of topic of conversation is about potentially having a domestic terrorism statute, right? And so if any of you were sort of at an earlier session where we had some people from the FBI talking, they were talking about how they investigate domestic terrorism, and how it's particularly challenging because on the international terrorism side, literally merely being associated with ISIS, being a member of ISIS is a crime. And so, basically the government can deploy every single tool it has at its disposal to kind of go after ISIS and eradicate it. And so there's been some question or debate on the domestic terrorism side of saying, okay, for organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, that we basically universally agree is a hate organization, why don't we just have a statute that says, being a member of the Ku Klux Klan is essentially a crime, and let's, start going after them, or that they can be prosecuted, that sort of thing. But I think, as you guys can imagine, probably one of the biggest issues with that idea is that it's a slippery slope here, to use just kind of, common law school term here. But, while we may universally agree about the Ku Klux Klan, what about if someone decides that Black Lives Matter should be on the list, right? And who's deciding that? I mean, is that Congress? Is that the FBI? Who's making those decisions? And so it is a very interesting position, I think, that we're in. We're a little bit between a rock and a hard place of wanting to have better tools, I think, and more ability to prosecute these groups. But at the same time, obviously, needing to protect our First Amendment rights and being able to speak freely about what our political beliefs are without fear that one day Congress may wake up and decide that my particular group, whatever that may be, is now a quote-unquote domestic terrorism group.
Thanks. Do you want to talk about the fear issue with plaintiffs? Did you confront that? Did you discuss with your family being involved, and how did that play into the decision making?
I'll tell you, after this happened, Charlottesville was just a few months later, and I remember sitting in my living room watching Charlottesville play out every single second of it. I could not leave my television screen because it was like everything that was happening in my cyber world was actually coming to life on camera, and I half expected to be looking out in the crowds and see signs with my head on pickets, and it was absolutely terrifying. And then watching Heather Heyer die, and then watching Susan Bro on national television the next day or 2 days after, getting up there and saying, "I do not regret that Heather lost her life that day. I am sad. But I do not regret that she showed up to stand up against this." At this point, I had completely decided to give up my career. I had barely left the house because I kept peeing my pants when I did. And I took a moment and hung on her words, and I thought, holy crap, I have to go back to work. I have to get out of the house. Because if I don't, they win. Thank God for Susan Bro. Thank God for Heather Heyer. Heather's picture is on my desk at my work, and it will be forever because she's the reason I come into work. And I hope to God that I can be that person to someone someday. To someone someday. I hope that the more we fight, the more we will become fighters. I just said this to somebody out in the hall today. Jews are not proselytizing. We are such quiet and such we're private people. We don't go out there parading who we are. So everyone's like, who the heck are you guys? And it makes for some questions, right? I almost feel like we should be following the lead of our LGBT community. It is time for Jews to be out and loud and proud about who we are and teach them the beautiful fundamental beliefs of who we are, that we just believe in taking care of other people before we even take care of ourselves. So that's the long answer to that question. I have no idea where we are even going.
Thank you. A little bit of time for some questions, so I'm just going to throw these out there. This first question, I think we can all answer in the negative. Is there any real prospect of Congress amending Section 230 to reduce platforms' immunity? Not this Congress. There is, however, a Supreme Court case to watch. It's Gonzalez v. Google, which is just getting going. The briefing is going to be happening over the next couple of months. There'll be a lot of amicus briefs filed, but it's testing the boundaries of Section 230. Do either one of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just quickly, it's a double-edged sword getting rid of Section 230, because if Section 230 also protects the moderation decisions that social media companies are making. So if you have a pre-Elon Musk Twitter that says you can't use the N-word, and then Texas passes a law that says any social media company that tries to silence people from using the N-word is going to be liable and unsued, Texas's law is going to fail under Section 230. So there is a upside to Section 230. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use a cliche.
The moderation component obviously is incredibly important to ADL. Right? ADL it relies heavily on platforms' ability to moderate content as we encourage platforms to moderate content. So Rick's admonition is pretty important. Anybody else want to comment on that one? This question right here would have been excellent, except I can't read it. Rick, can civil rights era laws be expanded to create room for civil suits against online-based abuse or harassment, i.e. public accommodation?
That's a really interesting question. So actually, but there are a lot of court decisions across the country that have found online spaces to be a public accommodation. And what that means is that, so there's a lot of laws that for example, the Javits Center can't prohibit Jews from entering from using its facilities on the basis of their religion or ethnicity. There are courts, including New York courts, that have found that online spaces are also public accommodations. And so there's a lot of, I think this is a developing area of law. I don't know that there's going to be new statutes, but it's a developing area of law to use existing public accommodations laws that have been very effective in reducing bias in the public sphere to reduce bias in online spaces, both from the companies themselves and from abusers online who are targeting people based on protected characteristics.
Steve Freeman, I have a question for that's directed to ADL. The question is, does ADL have potential civil plaintiffs in need of pro bono representation? If so, how do we attorneys make that connection? Steve Freeman, Vice President of Civil Rights for ADL.
Hi, everyone. So, thank you. We are always interested in talking to potential plaintiffs in civil litigation against extremists and against hate online. We don't have, apart from the case that I think Steve mentioned at the beginning about January 6th, there are a couple others that we're exploring, but no case at this point that we've committed to taking forward to court yet. We've also been working with Rick, Sawyer, and others at other attorney general's offices to see that there are ways that ADL can work with AGOs to use the powers that they have, and the information that we have through our Center on Extremism to go after extremists. So it's something that we're looking for. It's a capacity that we're looking to expand, but we don't have any other cases right now that we're quite ready to bring.
Thanks, Steve. For the whole panel, what is the unique value add of AGOs, DOJ, or private law firms or not-for-profits in these cases? Jordan, you want to start?
Sure. So I think the value in particular, I'll talk about law firms since that's where I work, but I think the value that law firms add is, most of the time the bigger law firms spend their time and energy sort of defending large corporations. And so because of that, we have a lot of resources at our disposal that then we can use to, take on other projects. And so I think what's nice is that you can deploy those massive resources to sort of assist in these cases that sometimes otherwise wouldn't have access to those same tools, right? And so just sort of by example, Jones Day has a hate crimes task force, for example, that really helps to litigate issues related to hate crimes, to provide pro bono representation. And so, we've talked a lot about Charlottesville, and so one of the things that my firm did in connection with Charlottesville was to defend the city council members who voted to take down the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson statues, right? And so, we've talked a lot about kind of individual plaintiffs, but there are also government entities, right, that are taking actions to try to stop hate and extremism, and they need support too. And so this is just kind of one example here. So there were, in particular, the city councilmen who voted to remove the statute. There was a move to enjoin the removal of the statues. It was the litigation lasted 4 years, again, as we're talking about how long these things take. So we're talking about 3 years of litigation. And ultimately, the firm was able to help get the claims against the councilman dismissed, which is great. Subsequently, the rest of the case kept moving forward as well, and Jones Day was able to file an amicus brief with the Virginia Supreme Court, basically arguing for the city's right to remove these statutes. And now, ultimately, the Supreme Court entered a judgment in favor of the city, and the statues were removed. And so I just think that's an example, though, where even the government really could have used a boost of sort of some of these private resources to kind of help make these things a reality. And so I think those are the types of partnerships that can really be very valuable going forward.
I mean, I can speak a little bit about Attorney General's offices. So Attorney General's offices have a massive amount of power within their jurisdiction. So in New York, we have subpoena authority for any kind of hate crime that's under Section 79N of the Civil Rights Law. We have subpoena authority against charities. We have subpoena authority against any business that's engaged in business in the state of New York. And so we have, and this is all before we even file a lawsuit, by the way, for people who are lawyers. So we get, we can get massive amounts of discovery without even having to go to court. And so, that's part of our unique role. So we have the opportunity to do massive investigations, look into organizations that are, sham charities that are advancing, hate speech. We can look into groups that are making money off of hate, and we can look into individuals who've committed acts of hate crimes without even going to court. And we can enter into creative settlements, like we were discussing earlier today, before even filing a lawsuit. So, Attorney General's offices, I would say, are an untapped resource in this area. A lot of our offices are waking up to the power we have, and a lot of, I've been working with Attorney General's offices across the country to kind of develop capacity in this area, and it's something where you as voters and constituents can keep pushing forward.
I also say that there's opportunity for collaboration across private law firms and government, and, for example, ADL. There was an episode recently where there was some brainstorming going on between Rick's office, ADL staff, and my office, trying to help address some of these Section 230 issues. So there are opportunities like that out there. So I've been told I have to wrap up our program. I have a lot more really good questions. Thank you for those. So first of all, thank you for participating in today's conversation. There are some takeaways and action items that I'd like to highlight. I think they're going to put some stuff up on the screen. You can take action now by texting repair to 72572 to tell your lawmakers to hold big tech accountable for protecting consumers on online hate. Is that up there? I can't see it. Okay. Second, you can visit ADL's website at the link on the screen to see how ADL is supporting the DC Attorney General in bringing federal lawsuit against the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. And finally, you can report incidents of hate, extremism, and anti-Semitism to ADL at adl.org/hate. report incident. I hope you've enjoyed today's program, and thank you all very much for being here.